For a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, there has actually not been much discussion of reason until now. As you may recall, we are still in the book in the massive part called the Doctrine of Elements, in which Kant is going to talk about the elements of human cognition. Now, sometimes Kant talks as if there are two elements of human cognition. One of them is sensibility, and one of them is the understanding. And we can see this in the way that the book is constructed, because we are at the moment in the transcendental logic, opposed to the transcendental aesthetic, which is supposed to be about the understanding. But at other points, Kant cuts up the understanding into two or sometimes even three different powers. The understanding, sometimes he adds the power of judgment, but let's keep those together for a moment. So on the one hand, the understanding, and on the other hand, reason. And especially here at the beginning of the Transcendental Dialectic, which is all about reason, Kant is going to talk about reason as if it is something totally different from the understanding, or at least, kind of separate. And so what we will have to do here is to understand what Kant means by reason. What is it that reason does that the understanding doesn't? And then we will have to understand what Kant's project concerning reason is going to be. And it is going to be, well, we have seen some indications of this already, but in a sense it's going to be very surprising, because Kant is going to tell us that reason leads us into the dark, well, into error, into illusion. That is precisely why he calls it the Transcendental Dialectic. For Kant here, the word dialectic is supposed to indicate that we are talking about the realm of illusion. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the introduction before we get to the proper parts of the Transcendental Dialectic. And in this introduction, Kant is going to introduce the idea of reason, contrast it with the understanding, and set out the main themes that will then be filled out later on. And the discussion here is very abstract. Right? It might not be ultra difficult, but it's very abstract. And things are going to get more concrete. We're going to get examples later on, which will make it more clear what Kant means by all the things he says about reason. Okay, so we start here with Transcendental Illusion. And Kant begins really by asking how error is possible at all. A question that was, for instance, also quite important for Descartes in the Meditations. At a certain point, Descartes starts with this total skepticism in the first meditation, but then after a while, once he has brought in God, suddenly he is faced with the opposite problem, which is, okay, but if there is this good God who sort of has created me in order to be able to find out the truth, how can I ever get into error? So that is Kant's question here. How do I ever get into error? And he tells us the following. This is just before B351. He says, error is affected only through the unnoticed influence of sensibility on understanding, through which it happens that the subjective grounds of the judgment join with the objective ones and make the latter deviate from their destination. He doesn't say very much about that, but the main point is that sensibility can't make any errors because it doesn't even judge. Under the understanding, if left to its own devices, is gonna, always follow its own laws and is not gonna make any errors. But when these two mix and we don't really realize that they're mixing, that's when errors can crop up. Now, when we get to reason, things are a little bit different. It's going to turn out to be the case that reason, when left to its own devices, is going to generate illusions, is going to lead us into error. Although reason itself, right, our critique of pure reason, in which we use reason in order to critique reason, is going to also enable us to sort of not lose the illusion, but at least sort of know that it's there and be able to deal with it. And that is what the Transcendental Dialectic is supposed to to bring us. A little bit later on, Kant again makes the distinction between transcendent and transcendental. Not, I would say, quite in the same way that he originally introduced the word transcendental. Here, he says, when he talks about transcendent principles, he says, I do not understand the transcendental use or misuse of categories, which is a mere mistake of the faculty of judgment when it is not properly checked by criticism, and thus does not attend enough to the boundaries of the territory in which alone the pure understanding is allowed its play. That the transcendental use or misuse of categories is what the analytic sort of warned us against, right? By showing us again and again that we can't use the categories beyond the bounds of experience. That's not what we're interested in now. Now we're interested in transcendent principles. And he says, I mean principles that actually incite us to tear down all those boundary posts and to lay claim to a wholly new territory that recognizes no demarcations anywhere. Okay, so transcendent principles are the principles that will actually tear down everything that we have built up in the analytic. It will be principles that sort of push us into the very realms where the analytic has told us we should not try to go. If these principles exist, that seems quite troublesome, right? If it turns out that reason has principles which contradict what we have learned about the understanding, then it seems as if human cognition is sort of its own worst enemy. And that is going to be the kind of worry that Kant will try to think through and to a certain extent dispel, but only to a certain extent, in what is going to follow. Okay, so here he works it out in the rest of this paragraph 1. And I'm going to quote somewhat extensively because these are, first of all, nice quotes and because they sort of show the gravity of the situation. So at B353, Kant says, logical illusion, which consists in a mere imitation of the form of reason, the illusion of fallacious inferences, arises solely from a failure of attentiveness to the logical rule. And so Kant is saying, one of the mistakes you can make with reasoning is that you make a mistake in an argument. You think it's valid, but it's not really valid. But that is merely inattentiveness, right? If I really think about it, I can see that I was wrong. Okay, right? As soon as I pay attention, these things disappear. They happen, but they're not very interesting from a philosophical point of view. We are talking about something else. We are not talking about logical illusion, which happens in a mere logical use of reason when it's just, reasoning. We are talking about transcendental illusion. That is something that will attend to transcendental use of reason. And the transcendental use of reason would be reason giving us concepts or principles a priori, synthetic principles a priori, that allow us to cognize things that we otherwise couldn't get at. Okay, transcendental illusion is if something goes wrong there. Transcendental illusion, on the other hand, does not cease even though it is uncovered and its nullity is clearly seen into by transcendental criticism. The cause of this is that in our reason there lie fundamental rules and maxims for its use, which look entirely like objective principles, and through them it comes about that the subjective necessity of a certain connection of our concepts on behalf of the understanding is taken for an objective necessity, the determination of things in themselves. This is an illusion that cannot be avoided at all, just as little as we can avoid it that the sea appears higher in blah 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 blah. He gives some examples of optical illusions. And the point of these examples is that even if you know that something is an optical illusion, right, you know that actually this and this have the same color, but when you look at the picture they seem to have a different color. Or you know that these two lines are equally long, but when you look at the picture they don't look equally long. Even once you know that it's an illusion, it still looks the wrong way, so to speak. Right? Knowing about the illusion doesn't dispel it. And that is also true here when it comes to logic. When it comes to reason, which apparently is going to take the form of taking some of our subjective principles and making them look like objective principles, principles about the objects themselves. So Kant mentions one example, which is the illusion in the proposition, the world must have a beginning in time. And I don't want to say too much about it right now. But basically, I mean, this subjective-objective distinction, right? When we think about what we have learned about events is that they have causes, right? And so if I know an event, it must have a cause, and I know that that must have a cause, and I know that that must have a cause, and I know that that must have a cause. And what impels me to go into like the direction of those causes and search for more and more and more of them is reason, which compels me to search beyond all the conditions for further conditions, and then finally to the unconditioned. This is in a sense a subjective principle. I mean, that is how my knowledge has to proceed. I have to take these steps. But if I take it as something that applies to the objects themselves, then I can start to think that, you know, what really is only a principle for the development of knowledge is actually a metaphysical insight into the past, into the world. Okay, we're going to look at that in much more detail, but this is a rough sketch of what's going on. That a sort of rule for the development of our knowledge is mistakenly taken for a metaphysical insight into the nature of reality, into the nature of the soul, into the nature of the world, into the nature of God. Those are going to be the three most important things, as we will see. So, we have here a natural and unavoidable illusion, Kant says. And he goes on to say that there is a natural and unavoidable dialectic of pure reason, not one in which a bungler might be entangled through lack of acquaintance, or one that some sophist has artfully invented in order to confuse rational people, but one that irremediably attaches to human reason. English, who has thought it up? So that even after we have exposed the mirage, it will still not cease to lead our reason on with false hopes, continually propelling it into momentary aberrations that always need to be removed. So there will always be this sort of push of reason into error, and we will have to constantly be on our guard. And in that sense, criticism, the kind of criticism that is the business of the critique, will always have to go on. Okay, so far for section 1. In section 2, Kant is going to tell us a bit more about reason, what it is. On pure reason as the seat of transcendental illusion. A. On reason in general. So here Kant, and I think this is interesting, starts with the following remark. He says, all our cognition starts from the senses, goes from there to the understanding, and ends with reason, beyond which there is nothing higher to be found. So we start with the senses, with sensation, like this all these little things that we sense. What we have seen in the understanding is that it creates unity, right? It relates different events, for instance, to the same substance, or it relates them as cause and effect in time. So it creates a unity among the appearances. In a sense, it creates the appearances by creating this unity. Reason is going to push this unity a step farther. And reason is going to push this unity a step farther, and Kant is going to try to explain to us in what sense. Okay, so what does reason do? What happens when I try to give a definition? Well, as in the case of the understanding, Kant says, there is in the case of reason a merely formal, that is logical use, where reason abstracts from all content of cognition. That is basically when we just talk about reasoning, right? The art of syllogisms, as Kant would think about it, like formal logic. Okay, that's formal. But there is also a real use. Since reason itself contains the origin of certain concepts and principles, which it derives neither from the senses nor from the understanding. Okay, so Kant tells us already now that, we weren't done when we had the table of categories, which we got from the understanding. Reason is going to generate certain concepts that are going to play a particular role in our, in the way that our knowledge proceeds in human cognition. Basically, this is the soul, the world, and God, but we'll get to that later. All of those play an important role in a certain way in our cognitive economy. Okay, so how can we define reason? And Kant says, well, we define the understanding as the faculty of rules. Here we will distinguish reason from understanding by calling reason the faculty of principles. And a principle for Kant is, in general, a principle is something from which something else can be derived. So he says, I would therefore call a cognition from principles that cognition in which I cognize the particular in the universal through concepts. So from some more general rule, I get some less general rule. It's purely about concepts. Like intuition doesn't really play a role here. That is sort of what a principle is. I think actually that the most useful, the most enlightening bit of this paragraph comes, of paragraph 2a, comes at the very end. So this is at the beginning of B359. And here is what Kant says there. If the understanding may be a faculty of unity of appearances by means of rules, so the understanding is a faculty of unity of appearances by means of rules. And we have seen how that works. Right? I have emphasized again and again that objects, like the appearances, are in a sense rules of experience. Then, reason is the faculty of the unity of the rules of understanding under principles. So what reason does is it basically takes all those judgments that the understanding makes and it starts to bring them under principles, right? It starts to sort of unify them. It is what takes all these disparate judgments and looks for, maybe it looks for patterns in them, or maybe it looks for something that started everything else and that explains everything else. It takes the unity of our thinking a step further. So if the understanding is what unified what is given in sensibility, what unified the intuitions, now the judgments that we make are going to be unified by reason. That is what reason does. Thus it never applies directly to experience or to any object, but instead applies to the understanding, in order to give unity a priori through concepts to the understanding's manifold cognitions, which may be called the unity of reason, and is of an altogether different kind than any unity that can be achieved by the understanding. So what Kant is going to have to explain to us, and what he's not going to do here, but only later on in the next chapter, is what are these concepts of reason that somehow allow it to unify the understanding in a way that the understanding itself couldn't possibly do. Okay, that is what Kant has to say, and that is what he is going to do for us in the next chapter. But this is the basic idea, that reason is going to bring something to the table that is not in the understanding itself, but which allows us to unify the judgments of the understanding in a new way, in a way that is going to turn out to be actually quite important for the pursuit of knowledge, even if it also leads to illusion. Kant is not going to dismiss reason. It is very important, even though it also leads to these illusions. On the logical use of reason, it's about reason. I'm just going to read the final sentence here. From this we see that reason in inferring seeks to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles, and thereby to effect the highest unity of that manifold. Right? This is almost a statement of scientific method. Right? We have all these things that we see in the world, that we find in the world. What is scientific method about? It's about creating theories that use as few principles as possible to subsume and explain as many of the particular judgments of the understanding as there are. Right? So reason is in a sense sort of, it's going to be the seat of method. I think that is a fair way of thinking about this. Reason is going to be indispensable if we want to have anything like scientific cognition, right? Like the kind of theorizing and unifying that is necessary for any systematic thinking about the world. C, on the pure use of reason, Kant goes on and asks about this not this logical use, but the transcendental use, or here he calls it the pure use, and he asks whether it is a genuine source of concepts and judgments that arise solely from it, and thereby refer to objects. Well, in fact, the manifold of rules and the unity of principles is a demand of reason in order to bring the understanding into thoroughgoing connection with itself, just as the understanding brings the manifold of intuition under concepts and through them into connection. Yet such a principle does not prescribe any law to objects, and does not contain the ground of the possibility of cognizing and determining them as such in general, but rather is merely a subjective law of economy for the provision of our understanding, so that through comparison of its concepts it may bring their universal use to the smallest number, without justifying us in demanding of objects themselves any such unanimity as might make things easier for our understanding, or help it extend itself, and so give objective validity to its maxims as well. In a word, the question is, does reason in itself, that is pure reason, contain a priori synthetic principles and rules, and in what might such principles consist? Here is maybe a way to relate this question to something that has exercised philosophers of science very much in the past half a century or so. So I just said that reason seems to have something to do with method, even with scientific method. Okay, so here's a demand that philosophers often claimed, a methodological demand that reason makes. It demands that we create the simplest theories possible. Right? We should strive for simplicity in our theories. Simpler theories are better than more complicated theories, if otherwise they can do the same things, if they bring us the same results. So here's a question, and a question that philosophers of course have argued about. Does this mean, is this merely pragmatic, like we like simpler theories, or do we have an a priori reason to believe that the world is simple? Right? Is this merely pragmatic, we like simple theories, or does reason give us an a priori reason, an a priori presumption towards a simplicity in the world? Well, that is the kind of question that Kant is putting on the table here. Is this merely pragmatic, or is it objective? Right? Do these methodological rules, or what we could take for methodological rules, merely subjective, do they in fact have objective import? Do they teach us something a priori about reality? Well, Kant is going to explain a little bit more what these principles of reasons would look like. It's going to be about searching for the unconditioned. Reason pushes us always to find a condition for the conditioned, but then it also wants to take a leap into the unconditioned, right? It wants to not just think about the cause of this effect and the cause of that effect and the cause of that effect, but now it wants to think about where did it all come from, right? Not this particular thing, where did that come from? Okay, that came from the previous thing, but where did it all come from? Right? As soon as reason starts to ask those kinds of questions and believes that its ideas generate answers to those kinds of questions, well, then we are asking about the unconditioned. That, is the condition for all the conditioned things, like all the events in the world. And Kant points out that this logical maxim cannot become a principle of pure reason, and this is around the beginning of A308. This logical maxim cannot become a principle of pure reason unless we assume that when the conditioned is given, then so is the whole series of conditions subordinated one to the other, which is itself unconditioned, also given. Such a principle of pure reason, however, is obviously synthetic, for the conditioned is analytically related to some condition, but not to the unconditioned. So what Kant is pointing out here is that when we make that kind of leap, okay, if I have an effect, then maybe I can analytically know that it had a cause. But when I make a leap towards the cause of everything, which itself doesn't have a cause, right, or the ground of everything, or however we want to call it, I'm moving beyond any merely analytic principle. This is some synthetic principle that I'm putting forward. This is the kind of thing that the critique is all about, right? To find out whether this could be justified, whether any claim of reasons to have this kind of synthetic insight into the nature of reality is justified. And so Kant says that is what we're going to do. And he ends this introduction by telling us precisely what he's going to do, like the kind of worries that we're going to have to deal with. Whether the principle that the series of conditions reaches to the unconditioned has objective correctness or not, what consequences flow from it from the empirical use of the understanding, or whether it rather yields no such objectively valid propositions at all, but is only a logical prescription in the ascent to ever higher conditions. Blah blah blah. Whether, I say, this need of reason has, through a misunderstanding, been taken for a transcendental principle of reason, which over hastily postulates such an unlimited completeness in the series of conditions in the objects themselves. Has it, through a misunderstanding, been taken for a transcendental principle? Spoiler alert, yes. That is basically what all the problems of traditional philosophy are going to come down to. And so on and so forth. All this will be our concern in the Transcendental Dialectic. And so Kant says, I'm gonna divide this into two parts. The first of which is going to treat the transcendent concepts. What are these concepts of reason that he has been, teasing us about? And then reason's transcendent and dialectical inferences, right? How does reason then go wrong in using these concepts? Those are the two parts. The first book on the concept of pure reasons is pretty short. The second book, The Dialectical Inferences of Pure Reason, is very, very long. So we will be spending a lot of time with that. But first, the concepts of pure reason, or as Kant also calls them, the ideas.